So hello everyone, and welcome to the online test conf day 2. This is the one before last activity on the sessions, the last formal session per se, because after this activity, what we will have are the lightning talks that are my personal favorite of the whole sessions, but it's not a formal session per se. And basically, what I wanted to do was to provide a presentation myself, a little bit about the future of testing. And this is a presentation called Will We Still Call It Testing in 2030, and How Will It Look? I want to invite everyone, just as with all the other sessions, to type your questions if you can on the Slack channel, and I will go over them towards the end of the presentation. Now, I do want to remind you that after the session is done, please do not leave, because we will have a very short break, and then we will do the lightning talks that we have been talking about. So one of the things that I realized is that at no time during the sessions themselves did I had a chance, or did I remember maybe to present myself and to explain who I am. So this might be a good time for that. So as you might know by now, my name is Joel, and you can follow me on Twitter at Joel Monte. I am a tester. I have been doing testing for the last 22 years. And during that time, I've had the luck of being a tester, a test lead, a test manager, test director, if you want. But in addition to that, around the themes of testing, I'm a blogger. I have my blog that I really like to talk about. I speak. Something that I need to add here, I also have a podcast with my friend Rob Lambert, and we did an episode yesterday. And also regarding testing, I am a solution architect of a testing tool called PractiTest. And in PractiTest, I basically have two main roles. One of them is being the chief solution architect for the solution itself, but I also function as the QA manager in charge of testing activities within the organization. And because I am a big believer on the community, then I try to do as many community works as possible. One of them, these online test conferences, and the other one, the State of Testing Survey and Report. That it's a yearly survey that we run once a year together with my friend Lalit from T10 with Testers. And actually, we got a call for it, I think, in one of the previous presentations. And the idea of the State of Test is basically to provide visibility into the world of testing so that people can understand what's going on and basically understand how do we testers need to plan our future based on that. And quite a lot of the ideas behind this presentation came from that State of Testing, from my work with other customers. Very quickly about the company that I work for, PractiTest, and it's a QA management system, an all-in-one. It's very intuitive and simple, but professional and flexible. And again, we invite you to go ahead and take a look into it from our website. There's a free trial for it, and you're more than invited to go and check it out. And again, we can basically leave it at that, and let's actually start talking about what we came to talk here. And that is the big question that I think that many of us ask ourselves. What's in store for testers in the future? And the big question is whether will we, by asking if we will still call it testing in 2030, I think that the question is whether we will still have testers by 2030. And it's not that far away if you think about it. It's only 12 years from now. And it's something that is actually coming. Okay, and I will try to answer at least my own personal view on that question in the coming 40 minutes. And you can agree with it, you can disagree with it, but at least take it as an additional way of looking at the world. And if we're talking about the world, let's ask ourselves the question, is the world changing? The world is changing. And for me, that's actually a pretty good thing. I think that if the world were staying stationary, then we would be in a lot of trouble. I also think that even though no one likes change, I don't like change. I think the change overall that is happening is for a good thing. And I'm not talking about global warming or stuff like that, but I do think that the way the technology is taking us and the way that we're advancing, we're actually being happier in that sense. What I also believe, other than the fact that the world is changing, is that the world doesn't change that fast. If you look at it, change is usually an evolution more than a revolution. And you know what? I'm a history freak, history buff maybe. I've been listening and reading quite a lot of history. And if you notice in history, there are usually not a lot of revolutions, but most of it there are evolutions, even if they're fast evolutions. And if you think about the most famous revolutions in the world, maybe the Industrial Revolution, or the one that I like is the French Revolution. The French Revolution was not a quick ordeal. It took years, tens of years, and it was never something that came out of the blue and surprised everyone. There might have been one or two very quick events that happened, but if you look at it, everything evolved. Everything evolved from stuff that was not related. There was an economic crisis in France. Then people wanted more power. They wanted less taxes. And all of a sudden, then more people wanted more power, and they fought with the king because he tried to escape. And France became a republic. So obviously there are quite a lot of more things on that, but it's not like one day France came and said, hey, we're a republic and we're going to do the French Revolution. It's always an evolution that is happening. And so I think that also if we look into the world of testing, testing as a profession is also constantly evolving. We're changing, we're developing. Definitely the way that we're doing things today, and we've seen it in many, many sessions during the last 2 days, is not even close to what we were doing 10 years ago. I can tell you for a fact, because I was doing stuff very differently 10 years ago, and 20 years ago, it was even more different than that. And so I'm sure that in 5 years from now, it will be different, and in 10 years from now, it will definitely be a lot different. And so the question becomes not whether are we going to change, but where exactly are we headed? And as I mentioned, usually when we look at the world as an evolutionary world, then we can actually go and look into a number of factors that tend to shift something, affect something, and push something to evolve. And it's the same around testing. It's usually not one factor, not for the French Revolution or for Industrial Revolution, definitely not for the testing evolution, okay? So I'm not saying that I know all the factors that are affecting, but I think I've identified a number of factors that, at least in my mind, are very crucial to the way that testing has been evolving. And the first factor that I like to point to is actually the factor of the evolution of the development practices around the world, okay? And it's very simple. If we look at the way that at least I started working back 20, 25 years ago, we used to have the waterfall model. And the waterfall was very simple. We had requirements, we worked on the requirements, then we worked on the design, then someone working in the implementation. Once implementation was done, we tested, then it was deployed, and it was maintained. Now, every single cycle was completely separate. And if you find the flaw on the implementation, you went back to design. And if the flaw was in requirements, then you went here, and you continue doing the waterfall. And some people think it was terrible. No, it wasn't that quick, but it was not terrible if you did it correctly. Obviously, there are better ways of working, especially if what we want to do is to provide services faster to customers. Oh, sorry, skip what actually one. Once we actually, after we actually moved from waterfall, then we understood that we could implement testing a little bit better. And we could implement testing actually in a more professional way, not only after implementation. So we came up with the V model that said that for every stage of the development cycle, then we had a testing cycle. And I think that testing became a little bit more professional as a discipline because we had different types of testing. It was not one box that was done. And I think that it became a little bit more professional to what we were doing. What happened afterwards, and I think that someone already talked about it yesterday, is that a lot of people actually came up together and started to understand there's a better way of working. We don't need to have projects that are 9, 12, 18, 24 months long. We actually need to provide more feedback to the customers and to get feedback back into the system. And so we started the iterative models. I'm not going to go too much into that. I think that all of us actually know Agile or Scrum in one way or another today. And what happened after that is that very quickly we defined that we wanted to organize stuff differently in a more, let's say, high-level model, and we started implementing all sorts of Kanban models on top of Agile. And what we have today is that we reached the point where we have what we call DevOps, and we saw a pretty cool demonstration of how that looks in a sense by Troy a couple of minutes ago. Now, it's important to understand that even this evolution in development practices, it's also influenced by other things. For example, how did we come up with DevOps? We didn't come up with DevOps because we want to do Agile better and that's it. No, we had Agile. And we understood that we're working in sprints, and we're working in sprints where we basically plan our sprint, do the design, build it, test it, review it, and then we launch it. But we had other people who were actually working on that launch. We had an operations team that was working. Um, and then we actually got to work on cloud computing, and we started having the cloud and all sorts of ways where we were not installing software for our customers. We were basically deploying on a cloud, so it was easier to deploy it multiple times if there were issues. And again, if you go back to waterfall models, I remember that if we found a bug on the disk that was being deployed or that had been deployed, was a very big thing because we couldn't fix it. And if the disk were on the mail, then it was a very, very big issue, because how do you explain to customers that you're going to get another disk on the mail? But right now, we don't have mail. We don't need to send by snail mail this to people because we're deploying on the cloud. So we had this. And so we came up together with the realization that it was better to unify the development and the operations teams. And we came up with the DevOps process. And again, it's an oversimplification, obviously, but we're planning our software or our release. We're coding it, building it, and testing it. And then the same team will release it, deploy it, and perform the operation and the monitoring on production. And based on this feedback from monitoring, we will do the same path again. And this will be a continuous process where we're building something, releasing it, monitoring, learning from it very quickly, and continue to use this information or to release it. So even this evolution is the result not only of methodology, but methodology and technology that work together for something. Okay, and it's important to always keep this in mind. The second factor, it's not only about methodologies, it's also about technology, and we saw a little bit about it now. Let's see, I cannot ask people here, but what do you see before you? I really hope that many of you won't even understand what this is. But for those of you who do and those of you who don't, this is Windows 9 3.11. Okay, it's a very old operating system before Windows 9, XP, everything that you had in there. And this is with what I started testing, and this was back in the 90s. Okay, now testing in those days was different. We had operating systems. We could actually go over stuff, and we had the registry, and our testing was completely different back then. Our platforms were completely different back then. But what happened in the 90s, the internet was already there in the 90s, but all of a sudden people started using the internet differently. And we started having e-commerce. And for me, the biggest example of e-commerce was a site called pets.com. It's defunct now, by the way. But these guys had a great idea. They said, hey, instead of going to the pet store to buy food for your dog, why don't you order it online and we'll bring it to you in a truck? And now it sounds trivial. We order everything online. Come on, guys. We order vacations and shoes and obviously dog food. And basically, I'm not sure that there's something that you cannot order online, but back there, this was revolutionary. We also started having browsers. And for those, this was my perfect browser back then, Netscape. And life was simple back then, if we look at it to the way that it is now. But then this became even more complex. It was not only about multiple browsers, it was about multiple devices. And after this, we actually started having quite a lot more technologies that started influencing what we need to test. So we have cloud computing, and we have big data, Internet of Things, blockchain, robotics, you name it, autonomous cars, whatever types of technologies, and we have plenty of those. So there's also a revolution on the technical level that is dictating that we need to do things differently. And if this wasn't enough, there's a third revolution or evolution that is basically taking part. And this is what I call the professional evolution, where we used to be generalizing people, then we became very specialized, and now we're generalizing once again. And the way that it looks is like this. Let's imagine how the professional tester used to look, depending on the times where you were testing. So around the 80s and 90s, testers were like Swiss Army knives. You had to know everything. You had to know how to install and test installations, and you had to know how to do almost everything that you wanted to do in there. So you were basically what is called a crossbar. You were not specialized on anything, but you actually had quite a lot of knowledge on many, many, many things that you had in there. Then all of a sudden, we decided that no, we need to specialize. And people wanted to be I-shaped. So these were the stages where, oh, I am not going to do manual testing because I only do test automation. Or I'm not going to do test automation because I'm a load tester. And oh, I'm not even a tester anymore. I'm a risk analyst. So people became very, very specialized. Thank God this was not very long-lived, and so we started coming up with different types of models, and that's where the T-shape came. And T-shape is nice because it means, oh, I have a broad base, so I know a little about quite a lot of things, but I specialize in something. So you might know a lot about everything, a little about everything, but you're very good at testing, maybe manual testing, maybe automation. And these models continue evolving into the pie shape, where maybe you have two specializations. And the one that I like most today, it's actually called the broken comb. I wish I had come with that one, but I didn't. And the broken comb is what I think that testers, developers, everyone who's on the development environment actually is like today, where we do have a broad base. We know quite a lot of things. And we have different levels of specialization depending on the method, on the technique that we're talking about. So everyone knows how to test and code and script and a little bit of security. And some of us will have more knowledge in some places, and we will complement others in other places as well. Okay, so I believe that these are the three factors that are having the biggest impact on how we are evolving as testers today. But again, the question becomes, where are these changes taking us? Because what we want to try to understand, or what I'm trying to understand with this talk, is where are we going to be in some years from now? And I think that one good way of actually finding this out is basically by understanding how did we define the reason for testing throughout these times. I believe in vectors, so if I understand a vector, I will see where are we actually heading later on. So let's try to understand the changes over time to the questions, why do we test? So back in the 90s again, and I'm taking you to my personal voyage because this is the one that I know, obviously. I remember when I started working for my first company, I was an undergrad, and they brought me in as a part-time tester, and they told me, your job is to find the bugs in the system to make sure that we can fix them. Okay, how do you find them? Well, you use the code. So basically, they told me, go ahead and work with the code somehow, find the bugs, catalog them in a spreadsheet, and let's make sure that we fix them. So after a while, I did it for some time. After a while, my boss came and says, hey, maybe it's not only about finding stuff at the end. Let's actually try to understand if there's a better process to do stuff. And we started at least talking for a while about risk analysis and how to do stuff better. But very quickly, as I mentioned, we had a revolution where we actually had, or an evolution where we had a lot of browsers to test, a lot of platforms to test. And so we went back into basically catching the bugs so that we could release none that faulty software outside. The answer to why did we test back in those days, for me and for many of my peers, was basically in order to ensure that we knew about all the bugs on the system so that we can fix the most important ones before we release the product. Okay, the important part in here is that, first of all, we were supposed to know all the bugs. Today we know it's completely impossible to know that, or at least it's not economically feasible to do that. The other thing that we want to do was actually to categorize those bugs and fix the important ones, but before we release the product. Obviously, the idea was you only release products that are as close to 100% good as you can. And we lived with this definition for quite a long time. And I guess that back in the day, we were happy with that, even though it was, as I mentioned, completely impossible to do it. But then the 2000s came, and if we were working on the V model, then we switch over to the iterative models. And guys, if there's a book that changed my testing life, it's Agile Testing by Lisa Kruskin and Janet Gregory. I think it's relevant still today. They even have a second edition. So if you haven't read that book, read it. It's a book that is so important that I usually buy it also to R&D managers so they understand exactly what do we mean by agile testing, how do you test in agile services. So there was a big evolution in there. We also started working quite a lot on client server systems. We started having Google and a little bit of cloud computing and a little bit of more devices. So life became more complex in the 2000s. And so our definition of why do we test also became different. From finding all the bugs, we actually started doing something else. What did we start doing? And by the way, I think that this definition is something that it's still very valid for a large number of organizations today. The definition of we test in order to provide visibility into the product and the project, in order to help stakeholders make tactical and strategic decisions, is something that I'm not sure if it's going to be 70% of organizations today or 40% of organizations today, but a very large number of organizations today, testing organizations, this is why they're testing. We are being tasked about not only finding the bugs, but we should provide visibility. Bugs and coverage will do it on the product, but people are also asking on the project, are we going to be able to release on time? And if not, where do we need to invest our time in order to make this happen? And we're not testing for the sake of testing. We're testing in order to support tactical and strategic decisions of our stakeholders. We are eagerly trying to provide business value for the organization because everyone is trying to provide business value for the organization. And those testing teams, those testers, are here to provide that visibility, to be the X-rays and to show where should we be investing our time and our money in here. And obviously, this is where I think that many of us are today. I think that this is where the bulk of the organizations are today. And the question becomes, what's going to happen tomorrow and what is affecting tomorrow? And I already said that what I think it's affecting today and tomorrow land for testers are the introduction of Kanban and DevOps approaches to the system, the large shifts that we have with the technologies and cloud computing and big data analysis, and obviously all the technology that is happening around us. And this is having a big effect on why will we test or why do we test. For some organization, maybe for the trailblazers, that is still today, but I think that as time goes by, more and more people will actually catch this reason for testing. And this is something that I'm basically stealing or borrowing from other people. And this is the definition that actually came, most of it at least, from the Modern Testing Principles and Alan Page and Brent Jensen's excellent podcast, A/B Testing. And what these guys are saying is that we are shifting the reason for which we are testing and we're working. We're here mostly in order to make sure that we're accelerating the achievement of shippable quality. This is what they're actually saying. I added a second part to it, and to monitor customer happiness. And let me explain what I'm saying here. Fact of the matter is, and many people have said also on the online test conf, we are not the only people testing. In many organizations, we're not even doing the bulk of the tests anymore. So we cannot be in charge of testing or providing visibility. What we are trying to do is to make sure that we reach that point where we can ship the products that we have with the quality levels that we want to as fast as possible. And so we are accelerating that achievement of shippable quality, making sure that we can provide those products as quickly as possible and with the levels of quality that we want. And we are accelerating that in all the sense of the words. We're helping people to test better. We're helping wherever that is needed, and that's where the broken comb actually comes into play. In addition to that, I do believe that we're finally in a place where if what we've been doing up to now all the time is simply testing, we are in the place where we can start having a role of quality assurance. We can do quality assurance all of a sudden. And so we can monitor customer happiness, and customer happiness is only the definition that Jerry Owen gave, I think, on the last online test conf for quality. If we have a quality product, then, or a product with good quality, our customers are happy, so we want to monitor that. And if we're working on DevOps systems, and if we can actually have access to that data, then we can totally monitor whether the products that we're delivering are actually achieving that level of quality and that customer happiness. So I do believe that this is a place, or at least a possible place, where we're going to be as testers and as quality engineers in the future. And if we look at how our roles have been evolving, so it's very simple. We started by being unprofessional testers, the guys that you send in order to just purge the bugs out of the product. And then we became better testing professionals, and we had teams, and we ensured pre-releases level of quality. But now we understand that we're testing specialists, that we're collaborating as part of a more complex team, and that we're here in order to drive quality, to enable testing and quality in the team as testing or as quality coaches. This is only a vector, guys. I do not know where this is heading from now. But this is, I think, that the path we're taking, and this is the road that many are following. And if we can see those trailblazers on the horizon, then we can surely understand that this is where we will need to be in the future if we want to continue being relevant. Now, but what do we do with all this information? How do we take it on a practical level? And the question to ask here is, hey, wait a second, is tester dead? Is testing dead, or is even testing dying? I love this question because I hate this question. And the answer is simple. No, of course testing is not dying. It's actually evolving. It's changing. Testing won't go out because developers and no one will generate excellent code from the beginning. You will still need to test it. The question is, what are you going to be doing? And how is it going to be changing? And what are you going to be doing in order not to be left behind? If the world is changing, how can you accommodate yourself, and how can you change yourself so that you will be ready for the future? And how can you prepare in order for the future of testing? Okay, and what I want to do right now is basically go over a number of things that I think will help people who want to be prepared in order to be ready for the future. And again, this is my personal view, but I'm happy to share it with whoever is willing to listen. The first part is very simple. If you're going to be preparing for the future, it's better to drive the change than to be driven by it. Okay? If, for example, we were talking yesterday with Rob on the podcast recording, testers need to drive quality. I hate it when someone comes to me and gives me an idea as a tester of, oh, this is what you could be doing better as a tester. No, guys, this is our responsibility. We need to have that initiative. We need to feel confident enough to drive that change. That doesn't mean that if someone brings an idea, we will reject it because it's not mine. But it means that you should not be afraid to speak up. You should not be afraid to change what's happening. Don't be afraid of change, because change is what's happening. And if you're afraid of it, then you're going to be left behind. Another thing that we need to do is to become at least pie-shaped. Better broken comps. We need to grow out of our comfort zone, learn technologies, learn other areas. And again, we saw the session by Troy, and we saw the session by Dan about security testing. There are quite a lot of things that we can learn today in order to be better Roundup testers and in order to be better suited in order to provide value to everything. You cannot be a specialized person who only knows how to do one thing and period. It's also important to remember that we are not, you're not going to be able to run all the test cases in your organization. So you will also need to know how to be a good leader. You need to be the person who's going to be driving people to run your test cases. You cannot run them all yourselves. That's a lot of communication. That's quite a lot of convincing and politics in your organization. All of that is something that you will need to learn, because again, it's part of the task that we're actually, we will need to push forwards if you want to. And in addition to that, I also believe that we also will need to focus on infrastructure. And infrastructure, people tend to look at infrastructure and say, oh yeah, we need a CI and CD system, or maybe we need quite a lot of test automation in order to run test cases. I go further than that. I think that, for example, many times we don't pay enough attention to testing data. So infrastructure might be to create good databases with testing data that you can share with developers, and so help them to test themselves better. Okay, can you have all sorts of containers that you can also share with them so they can actually do their work? So try to think about more infrastructure projects that can help you to decouple the testing tasks from yourself and from your team. I believe that also as testers, we need to expand where do we look for quality and not to look at it only on the pre-release testing stages, okay? For example, we should not only be looking at metrics of coverage in our code. If we know, for example, that we want to check if users are working with the system in order to use that as a measure of quality, then why don't we ask to have monitoring on the system itself if we're working on a cloud application? Why don't we go about instrumentation and try to understand, hey, are people using the system at all? If you develop something and people don't use it, and you don't even have an exception around it, that means that you built something with very poor quality because people are not using it. Or maybe it has great quality, but people cannot reach it, so your product is lacking something. We need to understand that quality is not only in the pre-release testing. We need to start saying that we're also responsible for quality outside of that. If the DevOps teams is also deploying the systems and monitoring it, that is part of our job. So you need to actively seek for that information. And it's also very important to keep our eyes open, because if there's something that we know, is that the world is changing. And even the stuff that I just said in here, it's going to fall short out of the things that we will need to do in the next 5 years, based on only on the way that the world is changing so fast and the speed of change that we're seeing all the time. So one of the things that we need to do as testers is to know how to focus and how to adapt. Keep your eyes on the ball and make sure that, again, if you need to do something else, go ahead and do it. So what skills will we need? And I touched a couple of those. But I think that there are additional things that we can actually do, and additional skills that we need to have in order to be better. So the first skill, and if I go back to the state of testing surveys, we always ask testers around the world, and it's thousands of testers each time, which is the most important skill that you need to have as a tester. And regardless of the type of tester, organization, or country, most testers will agree that you need to have good communication skills. I think that we're missing the mark here. Most of us think of communication skills as, oh, let's communicate the bugs and let's communicate also what we're testing, or maybe some graphs. No, communication is also know how to listen, understand what's important and what's not, and also to understand how to sell our ideas, how to coach them. Many people ask, hey, what can I do if my developers do not want to test? Well, of course you don't want to test dummy, but you need to explain to them, you need to sell it to them, you need to coach them into testing correctly, to understand what is something they need to do. So that is a big part of what we need to do as testers. And I think that all of these are skills that you can learn. The fact that you today feel that, no, I'm not a good, quote unquote, salesman of ideas, that doesn't mean that you cannot read, learn, experiment, and become better at it. Okay, I'm a strong believer that anything that you want to improve, you can improve it. It's only a matter of learning. In addition to that, I still believe that everyone on software development needs to know a little bit of development and a little bit of scripting. And make no mistake, testing is software development. So you do not need to know how to write very complex algorithms. You do not need to know how to do design patterns that are very complex. But you know what? To read code and understand what's written over there, to have a developer take you on a walkthrough of the code, you should be able to know how to do. To tweak a very simple script to modify the test that is running, you should be able to do it. Even to go as far as to know how to parse through a very large file or log file, come on, guys, this is very, very simple. And I think that it's mostly a matter of us not wanting to go outside of our comfort zone. There are great courses, free courses that you can take on Coursera about it. Udemy, tons and tons of testing communities and examples that you can actually go and do it. Take yourself by your hand and just learn how to do it, okay? We need to be less afraid of being technical and knowing a little bit of scripting in here. Obviously, there's quite a lot of technologies that we need to learn. And if we saw Troy's presentation, then we understand that cloud computing, Azure, working with Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud, all of that is a must. The same goes for Docker and Kubernetes. All of these are tools, very essential tools that you need to know how to work with, at least feel comfortable with them. Because maybe your peers will provide you with stuff that you can use. And if you do not know how to use them, it's basically, hey, you're being invited to dinner, but you do not know how to use a fork and a knife. So it will look kind of weird if you either sit next to the plate and don't eat, or you try to eat with your hands. It will look very, very bad. So these are today's technologies, and they're, after a while, they become very easy to learn. So at least the basics, you shouldn't be afraid to just jump in the water and understand what to do with this. There's also the part that I was mentioning before. If we are working on cloud computing and if we're working on systems that we can actually monitor, then we need to know at least a little bit of data science and analytics. Okay, we need to be able to do something with the data that is being covered. How can we understand what is happening with the usage of the system? Are people working with all the areas as we expected them to? When we release a new feature, is it affecting the existing usage? Is it generating usage patterns that are not what we were expecting to? We should actually, Troy talked about it yesterday when we talked about hypothesis-driven development. You make a hypothesis, you assume that by releasing this feature, then usage will change in this and that way. So after you have done that prediction, after you release that feature, after you have run your product for a couple of minutes or a couple of hours, go ahead and look at the data. Be able to verify whether that hypothesis was true or not. And if not, then think, hey, do you need to roll it back? Can you improve it? Remember that quality code, it's not only code that doesn't have any exceptions in production, it's code that is used at least how you expected it, if not better. So data science analytics is something that we will need to know because it's part of our tools. It's like going over a system and not understanding the data, the output of your test cases. Analytics and data science is going to be how do we work with that output of the testing in production that we're basically running. This doesn't mean, and I have been focusing maybe a lot on the technical aspects, this doesn't mean that we do not need to still be linked to our customers, linked to our users, and have those business skills that, quote unquote, business skills that allow us to still be connected to the business. Maybe you do not know exactly what your customers are doing, but you know what? You can proxy through them via your support, via your sales teams, via your product owners. We still are going to be that people who need to be the advocates of our users in our internal teams. So we cannot basically divorce ourselves from this role as well, at least not in my mind. And obviously, there are quite a lot of additional skills that you need to have. But these are only the ones that I thought about, and I think that the most important ones. And if there's something true about every single team that I've been to, is that context was critical, and there are teams that will require different skills, and there are teams that will have different challenges. So the idea is, how do you read those challenges, and how do you read the skills that are needed in order to basically work on those challenges that you have in there? So this is what I wanted to talk about, and I want to summarize right now and to go on to questions if you have. So basically, testing is not dying. Testing is evolving. It's evolving like everything else based on a number of simultaneous factors that are happening and changing all the time around us. I do believe that testing is and will be more about releasing quality products and less about finding bugs before they are released. We are shifting right, shifting left. I don't care where you shift. It doesn't really matter how you call it. But we are opening our aims to more than just making sure that no bugs are being released to the field. We are working more about how can we be part of that team that is trying to release products fast and with value to our customers. As I said, testing will not die, but it's definitely morphing, it's changing, and it's blending more with other teams and other tasks. So we need to understand how that is actually changing what we need to do, and it's very important to be proactive in order to push change and to adopt the skills that will require us to evolve. So you need to go outside of your comfort zones, and you definitely need to start learning how can you continue being relevant with your testing skills. And with that, I'll be happy if someone has any questions or observations or simply wants to fight with me. We can actually do it on the Slack channel if you wish. There's one here still saying that working with data is tough and infrastructure feels more doable. I think that it really depends on who you are. I think that depending on whether you are more of a person who likes working with the infrastructure, then it will be simpler for you. There are quite a lot of people who prefer basically to work with customers. There are some people who do prefer to work in production and analyzing data. I think that that's your comfort zone, and I think that that's the place where you basically need to try to challenge yourself to go outside of that comfort zone. Okay. And by the way, I do want to give out a call, obviously, to people who are thinking about this stuff and actually trailblazing this. And for me, one of the biggest ones is the A/B testing podcast. And you can go to angryweasel.com. That's Alan Page's blog, and you can from there actually go into the A/B testing podcast. And I do recommend that you actually listen to that podcast. Comment here about being proactive about the tools to enable the future of testing. I think that the tools vary very much. They will be, sometimes it's going to be open source tools like Jenkins and Selenium. Other times you might be working with the VSTS stuff. I think that it's mostly about trying to understand that you need to be shifting your focus into production and try to be shifting your focus a little bit away from where you are right now. Try to work with your DevOps team, if you are working on DevOps, or with your devices team or with your AI team, whoever it is, in order to try to provide more value into where your team is actually taking it. I think that what we need to do as much as possible is to be an holistic part of the team and not to think that there are areas where we do not belong. We belong to all the areas that the team is working in. The team is going into AI, then go into AI. And the team is going to API testing, going to API testing. That is something that you need to do. There's another comment here, actually a couple. How to deal with this change when other IT teams don't want to change also? I think that change is something that needs to also be something that is received by the organization. I think that we do need to come and show the value and explain the value and try to find within organizations that person who is willing to listen, that person who is willing to change. Maybe you won't be able to change everyone, but I guess that once you show value to that specific person, you will be able to sell it to other people in the system. How do we find a mentor if we're currently not working? Go to any one of the multiple communities in testing. You can go to the online test club and basically try to find there. There are quite a lot of people who will be able to mentor you. Just go on Twitter and search for the people who are talking about software testing. Many of them will mentor you for free. Another comment here, I agree that communication is the key, but if the leadership don't see the value in testing or think of it as expensive, how do we convince them? Do we use data or some metric? I think that what we need to do is basically convince the organization that we need to also focus, maybe not on testing, but on quality and production. To say, hey, you know what? We have data on the fact that people are using the software and we don't even know where they're using the software. If we were able to check if people are using the system how we think they're using the system, just by having some metrics and analytics in there, that will be tempting enough for your operations team and maybe even your product team to try to invest on that, to support you in that. From there, you need to actually continue pushing that wagon up the hill until you are the person who's leading there. What you need to have for sure is the understanding that in the same way that for many of us, for many years, our data was the results of our test cases and the number of bugs we had open or closed. These were the metrics. Now our metrics are, many of them, maybe most of them, are going to be in production. Okay, so don't be afraid of making that shift. And guys, with that, I'll be happy to continue on the Slack channel a little bit later on, because we need to continue moving forward with the online test conf right now. And by the way, if you want to contact me, these are my addresses. You can email me to joel@practice.com. I don't answer quickly, but I answer to every single email. My Twitter handle is @joelmonte. And if you want to read my blog, then go ahead, qablog.practice.com.